At 1 a.m., with rain hammering concrete and muddy water slapping the face of the Banqiao Dam, how does more than 1,000 millimeters of rain in a single day turn an iron dam into the first break in a chain that will tear through about 62 more dams? This is the 1975 Banqiao Dam collapse, and before there is any argument about blame, there are the measurements. Early August 1975. Typhoon Nina stalls over Henan, China. It does not pass through quickly. It sits there. It unloads water until the numbers stop sounding like weather and start sounding like structural pressure. Later, that deluge will be described as something like a once-in-2,000-year event. But this story does not begin with rain alone. It begins years earlier, with an engineer named Chen Xing. He looked at the dam and warned that it had too few sluice gates, too little room to release too much water. That is not poetry. That is mechanics. If inflow rises faster than discharge, the reservoir stops being controlled. It becomes force. And Chen Xing was not rewarded for saying that. He was branded a rightist, removed and ignored. So when the water kept rising over Henan, the danger was not new. The storm was extreme, but the warning already existed. What failed first here was not concrete. It was the system that decided which voices could be heard. Next, we have to look at why a stalled typhoon met a dam already carrying a hidden weakness. If you value deep historical stories told carefully, you can like and follow for the next part. That hidden weakness matters because a dam does not fail only at the wall you can see. By 1975, the structure in Henan was being treated as certainty made visible. Dark water held in place, wet concrete under rain, gates and channels expected to answer pressure on command. But Chen Xing's warning about the sluice gates points to something much more basic. A flood control system survives only if it can get water out fast enough when the sky stops behaving normally. If it cannot, then every extra hour of rain turns storage into strain. And this is where the language of safety becomes dangerous. Call something strong often enough, call it the iron dam, and people begin to confuse confidence with margin. They are not the same thing. Strength is what a structure can endure. Margin is what remains when reality exceeds the plan. In early August, with Typhoon Nina stalled over Henan, that margin was being eaten away in real time. By noise, by runoff, by water rising against a design flood threshold that had already been challenged before the crest even arrived. So the coming breach was not a single bad moment. It was pressure accumulating inside a system that had already pushed aside the engineer who asked the worst possible question. What happens when the water is greater than the design? Soon, that question stops being theoretical. And then, the sky stayed in place. That is what made early August 1975 so dangerous in Henan. A typhoon is bad enough when it moves. Typhoon Nina did something worse. It stalled. Rain hit roofs, roads, spillways, embankments, and kept hitting them. The air would have smelled like wet earth and churned silt. Water would have been drumming on concrete hard enough to blur distance and swallow ordinary sound. Over a single day, more than 1,000 millimeters fell. Later, the deluge would be described as something like a once-in-2,000-year event. For a dam, numbers like that are not just weather records. They are inputs. They become rising levels, pressure on gates, strain on slopes, force against every assumption built into the structure. The earlier warning about too few sluice gates now stops sounding like dissent and starts sounding like a countdown. Because once inflow outruns outflow, the reservoir is no longer being managed. It is accumulating intent. And this is where the phrase, the iron dam, becomes almost cruel. Iron is a promise. Water does not care about promises. It cares about volume, height, and time. Hour by hour, the storm was testing not only concrete and earth, but the belief that this barrier could absorb more than it was built to release. By the time that belief began to break, the danger was already moving downstream, before the wall itself gave way. By the night of August 8th, 1975, the argument was over and the mechanics had taken control. Water had risen past the point where release alone could solve the problem. Rain was still feeding the reservoir. The surface would have looked thick and dark under the storm, wind scraping it into waves, spray hitting concrete, runoff carrying silt and debris. A dam can survive enormous pressure when water stays where the design expects it to stay. The moment it begins to pass over the top, the danger changes shape. It is no longer just weight pressing inward. It is water attacking the structure itself. That is what happened here. The barrier was overtopped. At 1 a.m., it burst. The timing matters. 1 o'clock is the hour when command is weakest and visibility is worst. Rain and darkness flatten distance. Noise covers noise. The breach at Banqiao was not a clean engineering event, not some neat line on a chart. It was the sudden conversion of stored water into motion. Billions of cubic meters no longer held back, now moving outward across Henan with the force of a system undoing itself. And once that wall was loose, this was no longer only about one reservoir. The dam had been part of a larger chain all along. Downstream, other barriers were waiting under their own strain, and the water now coming toward them was carrying the failure of everything above. That was the moment the disaster changed scale. A single breach is already lethal. What followed this one was a cascade collapse. The water released at Banqiao did not spread into an empty landscape and weaken. It struck a managed system, one dam below another, one reservoir tied to the next, each barrier depending on the one upstream to behave. When the first wall failed, it sent force into structures that were already under stress from the same storm. About 62 downstream dams would go after it. Think about what that means in physical terms. Not one accident, but a sequence. Not one reservoir emptying, but billions of cubic meters suddenly transferred from storage into motion. In the dark, under continuing rain, the plain below was no longer facing weather alone. It was facing infrastructure turned against itself. This is why the old image of heroic control matters so much. The Iron Dam was never just concrete and earth. It was also an idea that water could be arranged, stacked, and disciplined by authority, and that each layer in the chain would hold because it had been told to hold. But hydraulic systems do not obey slogans. They obey load, timing, and failure paths. Once the first barrier was gone, the question was no longer whether the flood could be stopped. It was how far the chain would carry the ruin, and how many people were living inside that chain. Inside that chain, the violence of the event changed again. A dam break is not only a structural failure. It is stored height becoming speed. It is pressure turning into distance. When Banqiao went, and when the downstream barriers began to follow, the water did not arrive as ordinary flooding. It arrived as a moving consequence of everything that had already been misjudged. The stalled storm, the weak discharge capacity, the belief that the system could absorb one more hour, then one more. Across the plain, that meant darkness, fast water, and almost no time. Mud, broken debris, rain still falling, the deep, grinding sound that heavy water makes when it starts carrying parts of the landscape with it. The direct death toll from the flood wave is often given at around 26,000. That number is already enormous, but even it does not capture the full shape of what this collapse became, because the first wave does one kind of killing. The days after do another. Once the reservoirs emptied into motion, and about 62 dams had failed in sequence, the damage was no longer limited to the moment of impact. Water leaves behind isolation. It leaves spoiled ground, fouled water, broken supply lines, and whole populations exposed to hunger and sickness. That is why later estimates rise so much higher. And that is where the story stops being only hydraulic, because counting the dead would become its own kind of battle. And that battle begins with the simplest question in any disaster. How many people did it actually kill? For the immediate flood wave, the number often cited is around 26,000. That alone places the breach among the deadliest dam failures ever recorded. But that figure describes only the first violence, the water itself, the direct strike, the hours when the plain was being torn open by force released from storage. Then there is the larger count. When famine and disease are included, estimates rise dramatically, from roughly 145,000 to as high as 240,000. That gap is not just statistical fog. It tells you something about the nature of the event. A wall of water kills fast. A wrecked landscape keeps killing slowly. Through ruined food supply, contaminated water, broken transport, and people cut off after the main surge has passed. So the death toll becomes two stories at once. One is hydraulic. The other is administrative. Who gets counted? Which deaths belong to the flood, and which are pushed into the safer category of aftermath, as if time makes them less connected to the breach. That distinction matters because it changes the meaning of the collapse. If the lower number describes what the water did, the higher number begins to describe what the system failed to do after it. And once a state starts losing control of the count, it is often losing control of something even larger. That larger loss is control over truth. By this point, the flood is no longer only a question of rainfall, reservoir levels, or the timing of the breach. It becomes a question of what kind of state had built this system in the first place. Because the same structure that praised the dam as strong had already shown years earlier how it handled warning. Chen Xing did not merely make a technical objection about sluice gates. He identified a weakness. And the response was not correction, it was removal. That matters because disasters are often prepared long before they arrive, not only in concrete, but in habits, in whether bad news can move upward, in whether an engineer is allowed to be inconvenient, in whether a design flood threshold is treated as a real limit or as a political embarrassment to be explained away. Once Typhoon Nina stalled over Henan in August 1975, those habits were no longer abstract. They were sitting inside the dam with the water. So when the structure burst around 1 a.m. on August 8th, what failed was bigger than a wall. The physical break exposed an older institutional one, a system that had punished doubt and rewarded certainty, right up to the moment certainty drowned. And that changes the meaning of the chain reaction that followed. Some 62 downstream dams did not just collapse underwater. They collapsed inside a culture that had already decided which warnings were allowed to count. And once truth becomes unstable, the disaster enters a second life. The physical sequence is already clear enough. Early August 1975, Typhoon Nina stalls over Henan. More than 1,000 millimeters of rain in a day. By 1 a.m. on August 8th, the dam is overtopped and bursts. Some 62 more dams go after it, billions of cubic meters spread across the plain. Those facts are brutal but simple. What becomes less simple is what happens afterward, when a state has to describe a failure that was not only meteorological. Because this collapse carried an accusation inside it. Chen Xing had warned about too few sluice gates. He was removed. The storm arrived anyway, the structure failed anyway, and the numbers that survived in public memory split apart. One count for the flood wave, a much larger one when famine and disease are included. That split is not a side note. It shapes memory itself. A lower number can make the event look like a terrible night. A higher number makes it look like something broader, a long emergency, a failure of protection after the water had already done its first work. One version is easier for authority to absorb than the other. So Banqiao stops being only a dam story. It becomes a story about which parts of a catastrophe are allowed to stay visible, and which parts are pushed into silence, until the silence itself becomes evidence. And that is why the story does not end with water. After the breach, the plain is still wet, the ground is heavy, and the smell changes fast. Mud, diesel, and stagnant floodwater under a hot sky. But the harder thing to track is the record itself. The Banqiao Dam collapse was not only a physical failure, it was a problem of what could be said out loud and what could not. When a disaster is allowed to shrink on paper, the dead shrink with it. That is where the counting becomes political. The flood wave number is one thing. The larger totals, including famine and disease, force the event out of the narrow frame of an engineering accident and into something bigger, a breakdown in protection after the water had already moved on. Chen Xing's old warning about too few sluice gates now sits inside that frame like evidence no one wanted. He had named a flaw in the system. The system answered by removing him. So the question is no longer whether the dam failed. It did. The question is who gets to define what failure means. In a state like this, even the shape of the disaster can be controlled. A line in a report, a lower number, a smaller story. And once the story is smaller, the next warning is easier to ignore, which is exactly what makes the next part so dangerous. And the danger of a smaller story is not only moral, it is practical. When a disaster is reduced to the brief moment of impact, the longer mechanics of death disappear with it. In this case, the flood wave is only the first cut. After the chain of dam failures, the plain is left waterlogged, transport is broken, clean water is harder to secure, and food systems are no longer functioning the way they did before the breach. Hence the higher estimates matter so much. They do not inflate the event, they restore its duration. This is also where the old engineering warning returns with a different weight. Chen Xing spoke about capacity, about too few sluice gates, about a structure that might not be able to release enough water under extreme strain. But once the dam had already failed, capacity stopped meaning only discharge. It now meant the capacity of the state itself, to count, to respond, to protect, to admit scale. And here is the hardest part. A government can survive a storm. It can survive even a major structural failure. What becomes much harder to survive, morally and politically, is evidence that the same system which ignored the warning also struggled to face the consequences honestly afterward. So the collapse keeps widening. First, it was a dam. Then it was a chain. Then it was a death toll. Next, it becomes a lesson about what infrastructure really is. And that lesson starts with a very uncomfortable sentence. Infrastructure is never just concrete. This collapse looks, at first glance, like a problem of rain, storage, and failure under load. And yes, it is that. Typhoon Nina stalls over Henan. The water climbs, the dam is overtopped. At 1 a.m. on August 8, 1975, it bursts. Some 62 downstream dams fail after it. Billions of cubic meters move across the plain. Those are physical facts. But physical facts do not explain why the system entered that storm carrying a known weakness. For that, you have to return to Chen Xing. His warning on the sluice gates was not a side note in the story. It was the hinge. Because once a state teaches engineers that doubt is dangerous, every future structure contains more than earth and concrete. It contains silence. It contains fear of being the person who says, "This is not enough." And that kind of weakness cannot be seen in photographs of a finished dam. So the real architecture here had two layers. One was the visible barrier holding back water. The other was the invisible barrier holding back criticism. The first one broke in the storm. The second one had already been breaking the system for years. So Banqiao keeps reaching beyond 1975, because once you see the invisible layer, you start noticing it in other places too. And that is the real warning hiding inside the numbers. Once the lower count is accepted, the collapse can be discussed as a bad night. Once the larger count is accepted, it becomes a long failure of protection. So the argument over deaths matters so much in the 1975 Banqiao Dam collapse. It is not just about statistics. It is about whether the state can face what its own system did after the water moved on. Chen Xing had already pointed to the weak point. Too few sluice gates, too little release capacity, a structure pushed past its design flood threshold. But the deeper flaw was never only mechanical. It was political. A system that punishes warning will always look stronger on paper than it is in a storm. So Banqiao turns into a test case. Not for the river, not even for the dam, but for authority itself. Can it admit scale? Can it count honestly? Can it protect the people it failed once already? That is the part that stays open. Because the most dangerous break is not the one in concrete. It is the one between what happened and what the state is willing to say happened. And in the end, the final verdict is smaller than a slogan and heavier than a monument. The 1975 Banqiao Dam collapse was built out of rain, yes, out of a stalled Typhoon Nina, out of more than 1,000 millimeters in a day, out of darkness and stored water, and a breach around 1 a.m. on August 8, 1975. It was built out of about 62 downstream failures, out of a flood wave that killed around 26,000 by direct force, and out of later estimates that rise toward 145,000, even 240,000, when hunger and disease are allowed back into the picture. But it was also built out of one earlier act. Chen Xing pointed at the weak place, and the system removed the finger. That is the image that remains. Not only the broken wall, not only the drowned plane, but the small mechanical fact of too few sluice gates. And the larger human fact that saying so carried a cost. A safe dam is not just poured concrete. It is a place where warning can survive long enough to matter. After the water, there would still have been wet silt drying into a hard skin under the sun, and quiet reservoirs elsewhere still holding their own dark surfaces. The most dangerous structure is the one that still looks solid after it has stopped listening.